Good morning, and thanks for joining the webinar. I suppose I should say good afternoon, depending on where you're located. My name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. Before I turn it over to the main attraction, I wanted to introduce the IDSA to those of you who may not be familiar with the organization. We were originally founded in 2015 by Ping Identity and Optiv as the founding solutions provider. We expanded our charter in 2017 and are now operating as a standalone nonprofit industry alliance with 21 member companies and 4 customer advisory board members who you're going to hear more from today. And this is our membership. As you can see, there are a number of companies from both the identity and security space, and we'll talk more about why that's important. And thank you to our membership and our sponsors. I suspect everyone's heard the stats. They come at you fast and furious. Compromised credentials have been the leading cause of security breaches in the last several years. We exist to help organizations reduce the risk of a breach by bringing together their existing and identity and security investments, an approach that we call identity-defined security. We believe that by sharing identity context across your infrastructure, you are enabling intelligent decisions for all actions, such as authorizing access to applications, privileged access for system admins, or provisioning of new users to critical systems. And you'll hear more about that approach today and why we believe it's important. We think that there's confusion in the practitioner ranks. Organizations today go to analysts, vendors, solution providers, and their peers for information on advice on security strategies. It's difficult because then you parse all this information together and then determine your path to success. So our goal is to provide an independent source of information, aggregating the expertise of the community, vendors, solution providers, and experienced practitioners into resources that give you a pragmatic path to succeed. We've created a framework to help guide you. That includes use cases, security controls, and best practices, and I'll touch on those in a minute. We've done that through a forum for vendors, our member organizations, to collaborate on not just vendor-to-vendor integrations, but also through creating a cross-vendor agnostic framework. And those tools and resources are available to you to review and download and leverage for your implementations. We also have an online community that we're continuing to expand and foster that gives practitioners a place to share experiences and best practices. And lastly, we'll be sharing customer stories, such as Adobe, who you'll hear from Den Jones today, their initiative around Zero Trust Enterprise Network and how identity-centric security helps enable that initiative. We'll also touch on expertise from practitioners such as our panel today. Through the efforts of the IDSA, we hope to help you succeed in becoming more secure and ultimately reducing the risk of a breach. So as mentioned, we launched the IDSA framework in the fall of last year. The framework is a direct result of the efforts of the IDSA members over the previous 6 months. As mentioned, it provides use cases for complex scenarios, security controls that are discrete integrations between identity and security components, and best practices. The best practices developed and submitted by the Customer Advisory Board are not required to implement identity-centric security, but will certainly make it more effective. They are a collection of good hygiene tips that span people, process, and technology. I encourage you to read the white paper, review the framework details, and let us know your thoughts. Most importantly, its content, as mentioned, available to you to use for roadmaps, implementation guidance, and detailed conversations with your vendors. Hopefully this all seems like a worthwhile cause. We'd love to get your input into our mission and your help building out resources and tools to help achieve the mission. I'll come back at the end and give you some information on how to get involved and where you can engage with us. But now let's get on to the webinar. Today we have a few members from our Customer Advisory Board to discuss how identity and security have converged and the implications, as well as answer your questions about identity-centric security. If you have questions for the panel, which I hope you do, please submit them through the Q&A chat window. Our moderator today is Richard Bird, Chief Customer Information Officer at Ping Identity, and former financial services CISO and identity owner. He is a cybersecurity ambassador, identity-centric security expert, voice of the customer, and an advisor to the global marketplace on solutions for the most challenging business issues faced in today's world. Now I'm going to turn it over to Richard and the panel for introductions and our program.
Excellent. Thank you, Julie. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, as always, depending on where you are. Very excited to have you with us today. The formal introduction is always interesting for me. I like to put it a bit different way. Have been a CISO and a CIO, but I ran one of the largest identity functions in the world for one of the largest banks in the world. And all that did for me was allow me to take the beatings and the wounds earlier than most people. So I learned a lot of difficult lessons through that process. I'm very excited to have our guests with us today for the panel, a few of which I've had the opportunity to be on panels with previously, and some new faces as well. We'll do introductions. I'm going to go in order as you see it on the slides. Ask for Tom, Malta, then Narendra, Carlos, and Den to introduce themselves. So Tom, if you could share a bit of your background for the audience.
Sure. Thank you, Richard. And good morning, everyone. And thank you for coming. So this is Tom Malta. I've been with Identity for about the last 20 years. Landed in it by accident after 9/11 at Goldman Sachs and have led identity programs ever since. I'm currently the head of Enterprise Access Management Products and Services at Wells Fargo, and very happy to be part of the IDSA and with you here today.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Narendra Patlola. So I've been in the identity space for close to 20 years now as well. It's an interesting journey, as many of you have probably learned through the trenches. I currently work for Bright House Financial. I lead the security architecture strategy along with the identity and access management program.
Hi, good morning and afternoon. I'm Carlos Garcia with Optum. I'm a senior architect at the Office of the CIO. Off and on, I have about a 15+ year history at United Health Group / Optum. So most of my experience is being in operations, running the identity access management team for both enterprise and our patient, provider, and so forth. So it's mainly in the healthcare space, but a lot of interesting challenges there.
Hi everyone, my name is Den Jones. I'm the Director of Enterprise Security for Adobe, and I've been in the identity space off and on since the mid-90s. So I've worked on a whole different platforms as a practitioner, and then now my role in Adobe, my organization, we are responsible for the security posture of our employees and their data internally. And delighted to be here, so thanks for the invite and excited to be part of the IDSA.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for the introductions. I'm really encouraged and enthusiastic about this group of practitioners. For those of you on the line, at any time, if you'd like to ask a question, please don't hesitate to submit one through the questions window, the Q&A window, and we will try and catch those as we go along. But for our first question this morning, one that is going to be an interesting response from this audience, given your time and length and position. How has identity changed, the role of identity, either within organizations from a functional standpoint or organizations from a security standpoint over the course of your career? Now, let's start first with Narendra and then go to Den for first an identity perspective and then a more security aligned perspective. And then from there, the rest of our panelists can add their experience as well.
Thank you, Richard. That's an interesting question to answer. It kind of encompasses all the experiences that we have had and the battle scars that you mentioned, Richard, that we still remember vividly, though they might have happened 20 years ago. In my opinion, I think there is a dramatic shift on how we see identities moving towards becoming a mainstream capability within overall information security. As I've evolved personally and professionally, and so is the identity. And then, no pun intended, identity is trying to find its identity towards its evolution. Being a back office operation, somewhere in IT operations, sitting in and just creating an ID and a password to access applications. Some of those applications are still having that view in there. But over the years, it's encouraging to see that its evolution into becoming mainstream and becoming part of the integral part of the information security portfolio. And really, in some cases, it's becoming the differentiator and competitive advantage for some organizations. There's so much trust around it. As Julie and you mentioned, Richard, it's the breaches that you see today are somewhat tied back to then how the identity has been compromised. Irrespective of how we build our fork with other security controls, once the credentials are out there, then all bets are off. So it's interesting to see that journey come along, and encouraging to see that how the identity is playing a role in developing the 21st century organizations, that more and more information is digitally accessible today.
Excellent. Thank you,
And
Naren.
then maybe you want to go, yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So 10 plus years ago, identities were seen and required as an enabling business tool. So it was all about, I need an account, I need to access some stuff. And the quicker you can get the users up and running from an identity perspective, that was seen as a job well done. But now, and then attacks 10 years ago were brute force, password cracking, and that was the best they would do. So the reality is 10 years later, we get to where we are now, where attacks are more sophisticated, the identity can be phished really easily, and therefore it's not really just an enablement role, but everyone's scrambling to figure out, how do we secure identities better? How do we make that an enabler, but also a protector of the business? And I think that's part of the struggle now, is everyone's coming to realize that identities are very important to protect a business and not just enable the business. And as we go through that struggle, then we start to talk about, passwords and whether they're useful any longer, and how people are being attacked, and then why is identity at the center of all of that? And it's really simple, because in order to take control of a business, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to attack the human, and then from there you're going to go left and right, and as we call it, east-west. So you're using these identities to get where you want to go. And then you're also using these identities to gain control of other identities in the business, mainly privileged ones. So I think the struggle for this industry is, passwords are no longer good enough. Multi-factor, depending on what you're picking, is no longer good enough. There's a struggle as we move forward there. So I see security, in the security business, you try and get out of the way of the users, you try and become frictionless. And that's increasingly hard when we're trying to validate the identity and the human are still who they say they are, even an hour after they logged in. And so it's complex. And as Narinder said, it's now trying to find its own identity as we go through that challenge.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Carlos or Tom, thoughts on the subject?
No, yeah, I agree. I'd say about 3.5 years ago, I gave a presentation at CIS, and analogy I gave was that, for many years, it was like we were the security dog chasing the application car, and at some point, instead of trying to get away from us, the business hit the brakes and tied us to the roof of the car. And really is beyond enablement, kind of a realization where both from a consumer experience, the importance of identity. And I think from then on, that kind of alignment of identity and its role within the enterprise, within the consumer space, has grown from just like, oh, it's important to know our consumers. Oh, it's actually really important to know who's in our network and where things are flowing, and just the visibility of the identity team, which, I think back of when I started, at United Health Group, starting in 2003, I was the the one only quote unquote identity guy, and to where now it's a team of about 60 people and how it's grown. And so it's this evolvement of the importance of the role and the acknowledgement of the importance of it throughout the company in different aspects.
Excellent. Thank you, Carlos. I'm going to go ahead and move to a question that we've received from our attendees here, because I think it's a really excellent, relevant, and timely question. And just a little bit of background here. The question is related to customer IAM. And I think that that's fascinating because many of us have been in this industry long enough to remember a time when customer IAM was a function that was completely isolated to organizations such as the CMO. And not looked at from a securitized transaction standpoint. That seems to be changing rapidly. So the question that we've received is, does anyone see decentralized identity governance gaining traction, particularly within the customer IAM space? And where do we see, and I'm going to add a bit to that, where do we see this movement relative to authentication for customers going more broadly over, let's say, the next 1 to 5 years? Not sure who wants to take that one first, but
I'll start. That's an interesting question because I do see that as it's an interesting conversation because especially in regulated areas, healthcare, the notion of not having complete control over the identity at an organization where you have so many regulations and so much, this is your health data, this is your claims data. For us to open up the trust to an external identity system, there's a certain level of both education and also who does it first. Because in one aspect, you have the conversation, you're like, at the end of the day, when you're talking about, and I'm taking the decentralized identity as the comment of, hey, being able to use identity providers where they handle the authentication and you're still handling the authorization and maybe some of the step up. At the end of the day, there's a certain value and you're basically, offloading the password management and you still have the ability to do all your controls beyond the initial authentication within your organization. You could still have the step up. You could still have the behavioral. You can still have the advanced authentication. And so on one side of it, you look at it from a logical of like, what would really be the risk factor by allowing that kind of decentralized, where you do have a certain lack of governance, but you still have to go through the eligibility to get access. At least within regulated systems, it's not like it's anybody could get in. You still have to go through a certain level of eligibility process. So it's both logically sounds like, well, why can't you do it? But there's also this kind of level of comfort that needs to be established, and also like, well, how are other heavily regulated like finance going to handle this? And so I think it's still quite a bit out before we get to that point. And I think right now decentralized only goes as far as within healthcare, other healthcare providers where you have more of a ecosystem as opposed to that consumer space.
Sure, Carlos, I appreciate that. Narendra and Tom, I'm actually going to put a slight spin on this because I like the reference to the financial services component, given the banking background that's on this phone, especially with PSD2 and the idea of decentralized authentication. Carlos, I think you hit the nail right on the head, which is the great thing about banks so far is that they have indemnified everybody that's ever had anything gone bad relative to their accounts. But when we introduce third parties or other parties that do authentication, the question in my mind is, are they also taking on the liability for bad outcomes for those customers? So Narendra or Tom, I'd be interested in your perspectives on where the CIAM space is going.
Yeah, I think, Richard, you kind of mentioned that, right? It's a journey and a movement that has started, and it's a multifaceted view of how we look at this by creating this decentralized nature in there, right? So there's lots of attributes that needs to be considered, like you mentioned, who takes the liability when it comes to a financial transaction or healthcare information or some sort of a sensitive data. I think before we get to that fully decentralized model, even though it's out there in the future, I think contextually relevant authorization might pick up, right? So contextually relevant authorization of providing the relevant information that is accurate for that transaction itself, not rather than giving all the information that is required as the static authorization to those transactions. And how, at what point that becomes in a decentralized manner, that's interesting to watch that space to see how we evolve. There is certainly some organizations that are trying to kind of bring that into practice. As you mentioned, some of the banks are actually looking at to see, creating to what back Carlos said, right? So this is somewhat of a private space that, although they are combining some of the similar organizations within it so that they can share the responsibility rather than in one central organization.
Yeah, hey, this is Tom. Just to add to that, I think what's interesting is that if you look back kind of at customer identity in the past, right? I mean, it's still traditionally username, password in a lot of organizations for front-facing web applications for customers to come in, and whether they're looking at their balance or they're moving money around or what have you. I think of late, what you've seen now is that the addition of, multi-factor, and what I like to think of as N-factor authentication, where authentication is based on risk, right? What types of transactions is the customer trying to do? And do we need to do a step up and ask for a biometric or for an additional type of authenticator in order to allow that person in, or allow them the ability to get to what they want to get to? I think the other thing that's touched in this question is around customers governing their own identities, right? And some of the movement, whether it's with blockchain, and Naren just touched on it a little bit. What we have seen in some of the financial services organizations is that movement around that sort of private blockchain technology, right? Where big institutions can kind of subscribe to it and start to transact across that open ledger concept. Now, will it move out into the customer market? Will we actually see blockchain technology become mainstream? The question is still out there, right? But I think it's encouraging to see a lot of these new technologies coming in, and also, frankly, encouraging from a customer perspective, right? Where a lot of people saying, you know what, if I have the ability to add additional factors to my authentication protocol, I want to do it. I don't want to have a never expiring password, right? I want to be able to use my face and my fingerprints or my voice or whatever it might be to authenticate. So we are seeing the consumer market, I think, switch to understanding that, because of all the breaches, right? People are starting to get educated and help push that momentum as well, I think.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone, for the response to that question. We've actually got another question that has come in, but before I get to that one, I want to get to a question that we've worked on collectively together with the IDSA, as well as a number of us in the market, and it is this notion that there is a move, particularly among us identity practitioners, to drive for the consideration of identity-centric security, both in design and execution, as opposed to decades-long focus on asset-based security. So when we move to putting the user, the customer, the partner, the person, the human being into the center of security, what does that look like for each of you, and what is that path going to take within either your organizations or the function that you're managing to start to get traction for that? So Dan, if we could start with you, be curious as to what you guys have been doing.
Yeah, so we've been on this adventure of zero trust, and it's funny because the IDSA is obviously a very identity-focused group of folks, right? But the thing missing from that equation is you can step up, step down the auth, you can re-auth, you can do all the wonderful things in the world. At the end of it, you're still on a device that may be compromised. And so if I'm a user and I've logged into something and the authentication doesn't take into account the device you're on or has any clue about that device, then yeah, I'm authorizing Den to get in, but I may also be authorizing bad actor number 57 on Den's laptop to also get in as well. So if you think of the multi-factor authentication, and I'll do one auth and I'll let that token live for 12 hours because I'm trying to be nice to the customer base. The reality is I'm also letting that bad actor be in for 12 hours. And if we have SAML enabled 1,500 applications, I think Adobe now with about 1,800 applications are SAML enabled. I'm basically giving access to 1,800 apps for 12 hours. So we're really changing the approach on our zero trust. It's not the same as some of the other zero trust type implementations. Our first thing is user-based benefits, where we are now taking the device, we're using our MDM solution of choice, and even part of how we became engaged with the IDSAs, we took 2 vendors who were IDSA members, and we had them work on building a product, a connector between their two platforms so that we could pull this off. At time of authorization, we're doing a check on the device. So we're not just authorizing the user, we're authorizing the device. And instead of using passwords, we're using certificates now, which are tied to the device and the user. Now, the benefit that has is if one device is compromised and we know it is, we can revoke the cert of that one device, which is tied to the user and the device, but the user's other devices are still active. So we can get really fine-grained and start to also put requirements and checks and balances into what we expect on the device in order for them to access certain applications. So it's enabling us to become really restrictive and selective on how we're doing authentications now. And it's not just the user. The way we're being successful in driving that security goal is by making it easier for the users. So by using certificates and second factor on almost
I believe we lost Den there. Can everybody else still hear us amongst the panelists?
Yep.
Yeah, I can hear you.
It was me,
Okay,
but
great.
I can hear you. Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. We had a full disconnect there. So actually, just to keep things flowing, Narendra, if we could have you maybe give your observations on that.
Yeah, definitely. Like Den was mentioning, the way I look at it is, if I may be bold enough and say this, right, the convergence of human to non-human identity, the line is blurring a little bit. So the device that I use is essentially becoming an extension of myself on how I authenticate and get access to some of the assets that I get to. So it's an interesting point to see how that plays a role in how we access the information going forward, and decreasing that friction of how we get access to it, at the same time increasing the posture, which is quite frankly why I get passionate about this space, is that you're kind of playing a role between the ease of use and also the security on the background. To balance that act, it's always an interesting challenge.
Agreed. And I'm actually going to move into the next question. And for Carlos and Tom, if you have strong positions or opinions, it should weave nicely into this question because I see it as an extension. And the question is related to newer technologies that are coming online, which is, as we begin to look at authentication not as a one-time event, as we begin to do continuously data-driven authentication, some of the higher tier next-gen activities that a number of us are working on, do you see that as a much more intrusive way of managing a user's session or their interaction with systems and data? Do you see it as something that's should be more managed by a UBA or UEBA? How do you think we're going to see the evolution of much more fine-grained, data-driven authentication for users in the future? And Carlos, we'll start with you, and then go to Tom, and then we'll catch everyone else.
Well, I think it's going to depend on the target audience. We look at some of the UABA stuff that we're looking at implementing, and even with earlier technologies as simple as single sign-on, you have more leeway in how you handle it within your enterprise, within your employees, in the sense that the notion of friction, for better or for worse, you're going to add more friction because you're protecting the data that your employees have access to. So through all that different, capabilities, to monitor what's going on, it's acceptable to have a little bit more friction. On the consumer side, in our case, especially like the provider side, the doctors and physicians who are using our systems, as well as the consumers, that the friction becomes more unacceptable. And so trying to do things as subtle as possible, as non-noticeable as possible, that becomes a big driver. So trying to be more particular in how you implement those technologies is very important. So it is a bit of a depends on who your audience is and how intrusive you're going to get in it. See, Tom?
Yeah, so this is Tom. Yep, thank you, Carlos. So just to add to that, I think, when I think of authentication and authorization, so some of the things that are happening in the industry now, and a lot of people have touched on it already on the panel, I think, when you think about authentication, the old traditional user ID password is starting to move away, right? Even a lot of the NIST standards and a lot of the things you see in the industry are moving more towards, hey, everything needs to have multi-factor on it, right? To get people into the network, into being able to be authenticated. When I think about authorization, and one of the things that we're looking at right now is sort of role-based, right? Meaning we think of roles as coarse-grained. So if you're giving access to a teller, right, and maybe you have tellers throughout the bank, some that look at consumer banking, some that look at wholesale banking. Well, it turns out they have the same set of applications, right? So the old traditional methods of RBAC would actually go all the way down to the data layer and grant a role that would actually give that teller access into the consumer banking, data, and be able to transact all of the things that he or she needs to do. The same thing for the wholesale teller, right? Well, the problem with that is that you end up with role proliferation. You end up with mismanagement of the roles itself. It becomes a mess. So we're kind of thinking about it more as a coarse-grained thing, where we want to give access to those tellers, right? They're sharing the same suite of applications. So give them access down into the application layer, and then at runtime, check their authorization and see what they have access to in terms of the data, permissioning to the data. So it's basically authorization as a service at runtime, based on attributes, based on policies. So it's something that we started to take a look at. We're hopeful that that might be a good way to control it in the future without having, what I would call role proliferation, and also being able to protect the finer grain assets.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. I'm going to go ahead and keep questions rolling along here, but I have to tell you, you made my my skin crawl a little bit, bringing up the role proliferation and RBAC. I remember the days when we first started. Yeah, when the days we first started at RBAC, and we were trying to explain the business that 3 roles for every user was not role-based access control.
Exactly.
So, yeah. More roles than human beings means that your RBAC initiative failed. So I'm really glad for reminders of that. But back to the questions that we have in hand. One of the things that I'd like to emphasize for our listening audiences is that I do see personally, and I've been involved with IDSA for quite some time now. I do see the value of IDSA, not just being the architectures and reference diagrams and everything, white papers that are developed, but more importantly, that it is it's an all-encompassing organization relative to solution providers and customers, as well as a number of other thinkers on the subject. And that being said, for this audience or for this panelist group on the phone, I'm curious, how do you see solution providers in identity enabling your movements to identity-centric solutions? And frankly, I'm interested and also sensitive. Frankly, where do you see them either falling behind or not hitting the mark? And then since we lost you for a second, if we can start with you.
Yeah, glad to be back, I guess. So it's very interesting. So let me actually just start with where I think some vendors are failing, and because it actually builds onto the thought of where I think we need to be, which is a lot of vendors, they'll have a portfolio or a suite of products, and they'll try and go into the business as if you're going to buy all their products because they're all interconnected and interwoven. The problem is with that mindset is we are in a situation where all of us, we run companies and products and services in our organizations where there's years and years of technology investment. So you can't suddenly say, I'm going to swap, 5 different products and bring in one new vendor and consolidate all that stuff. You can't do that as easy as it sounds on paper. So the reality, I think vendors need to kind of pay attention to the fact that while they may have a suite of products, these things need to be modular so they can be dropped in as a unique SKU and integrated with other vendors' products from the start. And I think this is the thing. So this is A, why I'm attracted to the IDSA work, but B, because every time I speak with vendors about a problem we're trying to solve, they will always try and get me to go, well, let's go to the big picture and let's look at this and this and this. And then they'll try and oversell. And they'll try and oversell 5 other products along with the big one that I really need. I don't have the investment to do that. I don't have the resources to do that. I have the problem right in front of me that needs solved. And while I think from a strategy perspective, you could step back, the problem is that may not be possible. So I think vendors need to really pay attention to that. And their opportunity is if they actually build with a mindset of integrating with other vendors from the start and they architect their solutions that way, and it'll be easier for consumers to purchase their stuff, bring them in, get some value quickly. And then if you can, and they're doing a really good job, then maybe you have an opportunity at some point when the next renewal of the other thing comes up to swap it out. But you don't ever have the ability to swap out all of the stuff. And when we were doing our Zero Trust initiative, that was one of the big observations that we had was there's not one vendor that can enable everything we need. There's 5 vendors that enable it, 4 of which we already have investments in. So now it's just plug these things together. So our Zero Trust thing, it literally was a 3-month effort to get our vendors to integrate and be up and running. And we look at other companies like Google, they've been doing their Beyond Cart for 7 years, but they rebuilt environments. We didn't rebuild an environment. So I think the ability for have vendors to work together is really, really important if they go in with that mindset from the start and they build their products that way.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. And Narendra.
Yeah, let me start by saying this, as most of us remember, right, even within the identity space, when we are trying to get, whether it's administration in the background or authentication in the front ground, each of them operated independently. And I'm thrilled to see the movement, not just from a practitioner's side, but also on the vendor side, to figure out a way that they could integrate out of the box. And that movement is, as you can see, many of the vendors, including the IDSA initiative that we have, whether it's community driven or it's vendor participated, right? The movement there is that our life as practitioners is somewhat becoming easier. There were days I could spend days and nights trying to integrate the, now we call the IGA product, but really the administration product into the authentication to do a single sign-on. There's got a lot of time spent, right? Whether I create an abstraction through a virtual directory space or whatever that might have been, that I spent a lot of time to configuring them to work together, let alone that integrating those products into the broader security suite. But whereas now, if you go and look at, majority of the vendors have out-of-the-box connectors, right? It's just a click and play of how you connect them. And then that integration helps us to actually realize the business value and enhance the security. So when we go to, whether it's a C-level executives or to the board of directors and present the case, it becomes more cumulative of how we protect the information rather than trying to figure out, spending a lot of time in integrating those products. So it's encouraging to see that.
Very good. Carlos.
Yeah, no, I agree very much. We've had that struggle with vendors. And I think the most important thing is that, being able to, the best thing vendors can do is adopt, modern standards around API, modern development standards to ease the way that these things are put together in order for that, identity data to flow between them. At the end of the day, that's the easiest way, because then it's the same as it's similar to the way that we look at offering identity services. You don't want to have to teach your developer and community, this is how you use this product. You want to teach your developer community, this is how you access these identity services through these programmatic standards, using these identity standards. And that makes it, simpler, because from a developer point of view, it's that, ease of integration. And at the end of the day, that's where your cost comes in. So the same thing can be applied between vendors, in the sense that vendor A is going to find an easier way to integrate with vendor B when they both expose a lot of their services to those mechanisms as well, and making the integration between them easier.
Excellent. And Tom?
Hey, this was good discussion. I'd just like to add a couple of points. I think one, from a pure security vendor, identity vendor perspective, I mean, in some cases, I have seen vendors fall a little bit short, meaning they don't necessarily have the voice of the customer in mind, or really understand at a corporate level what needs to happen in their products. And even some of the leading ones, right? I think sometimes don't always listen to their customers, and that's really key. I think with the IDSA, we're obviously trying to change that, with bringing vendors together and bringing practitioners together, and that voice of the customer is really, really key. The only other thing I would add, Richard, is on the service provider side, whether it's a big four, whether it's a small mom and pop shop that you're using to help you with your program, don't give up the kingdom, right? Meaning, make sure you have your own people, working through it with them, right? You touched on in the opening question, what do they not know? What do they think they know, right? I think that's part of the problem. Sometimes they come in and they've done X number of implementations, but your implementation is different, right? And you need to make sure that your value add to the program is to make sure your people, your brain trust is driving that, right? They're there to help you, but don't give it up to them.
Excellent, excellent. Great responses from everyone. Listening to those responses, it reminds me of kind of our journey. Again, we have a number of practitioners on this panel that have been in this business for a long time, and we've seen so many iterations of solutions as they've come along. I'd actually kind of like to dovetail into a last question, to be respectful of time for the panelists as well as those that are attending. The second part of the question is just share a little bit about how you feel the IDSA is helping you move forward as both a practitioner and a voice in the marketplace to resolve these issues. But before that, somewhat associated with the last question, is your take on how you're managing what I certainly experienced, and what I believe that most everyone else that's on this phone is experiencing. How are you dealing with the resource shortage, whether that be solution providers through solution integrators who are picking off the same contractors that small integrators are picking off or are trying to hire? What are you doing within your with your function within your operations to grow, build, and develop or acquire talent? And then how is IDSA helping you more broadly relative to the concepts that we've talked about? And Carlos, if we can start with you.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of good questions to go through. And that, yeah, the issue of workforce, it is a struggle, and I've been an advocate for the notion of bringing in talent that's not always, everybody always wants to hire a, senior IAM or security resource with, 50 years experience. And nobody really focuses on building that pipeline of where do we build up, knowledgeable, smart employees that can be really good within a year. Instead, you spend a year trying to find the perfect resource that you don't find. So it is of building that talent pool is extremely important. And I go back again to kind of my earlier comments in regards to the notion of IDSA and how it helps is those patterns are really super useful in the sense of where does the majority of your cost, effort, time come in? It's not actually getting the product. It's not getting the product up and running by itself, because those things aren't extremely difficult. It's the actual usage of them. It's the integration. It's how making them available to the rest of the organization, and getting into those advanced use cases of integrating identity with everybody else. If it was easy, then everybody would be able to do it. It goes back to the product space has to get more mature in the sense of that ability to create programmatic ways that are based on programmatic standards to be able to move the data in between them and make the integrations a lot easier, because whether a standalone or within the notion of a integrated platform, it just makes it easier. It lowers the cost. It lowers the requirements for having a large staff to support it and to build in that abstraction. For some of our products, we had to develop our own abstraction layer that enabled to have those REST APIs in front of these legacy systems, because they're legacy and their roadmaps to enable things like REST were years and years out. So that takes effort from our side to get those things working. So that'd be the best thing vendors could do, is really bring their products into kind of more modern architecture as much as they can. And that has a cascading effect on the operations of them and the integrations of them.
Excellent. And Dan, your observations.
Yeah, I was just, so we're not nearly as large or complex as a bank. Software is a different market entirely. So our life was, we were watching the growth of a manual team, and rather than continuing to hire IAM people, we started to hire developers and people who could automate stuff. So we ended up going, as the team was growing, almost doubled in size from 10 to 20 people in about 3 years, about 10 years ago. And then we started to replace and hire automation people and bring in a decent technology for provisioning. And then all of a sudden we went down to 2 people for manual provisioning and 4 people for automation. So we reduced the team in half. And then as Carlos mentioned, the notion of legacy stuff, it's really a different drive. That's not an identity problem. That's a problem of organizations being really slow to get rid of legacy technologies and not accept vendors' answers to not have a good roadmap. So we've started to tell our vendors, if you don't have a good roadmap for supporting the things we need, then we will actually swap you out at the next renewal cycle. And we're starting to send that message, which they don't like it. But there are some big, and it's really funny, there are some big companies, and RSA is one of these companies. If you look at RSA Archer, they do not support good authentication. So we're having conversations with them about it, which is, look, guys, you're letting us down, and you're meant to be a security company. So that's how bad the problem is. In the industry, there's companies who are in the security game or the governance game, and they're not even keeping up with the standards or helping move the standards forward. So we need them to be serious about this goal.
Excellent. That's an outstanding observation. And Narendra.
Yeah, it's the way I look at this is as part of the evolution, right? It's really an evolution, how we look at this. And then that evolution, sometimes we fall prey to of a sine wave, going down, coming up. And it all really depends on the kind of industry that you're representing and you've been working with. In my previous life, right? So we had 70 acquisitions in the span of 5 years. And when you look at that, and when you have this large number of people performing provisioning, and that provisioning is kind of distributed in multiple companies that you acquire and try to converge that. And then you bring in technology to automate. But the movement around automation is certainly taking place. And it certainly depends on the organization culture of how we want to innovate into the future, whether we are happy with the army of people doing that mundane task as operational tasks, Or some people are getting on to this, I don't like to use the buzzwords, but the robotic process automation, literally replacing the manualness of that human beings performing through some scripts, right? And then really getting on to such as this initiative to make more automation into it so that we are more efficient and we are in line with the regulatory aspects of the business that you're in. And then I strongly believe that if the architecture plays a role in there, that compliance and regulation is a byproduct of that.
Good points as well. And finally, Tom, we'll wrap up with you.
Sure. The only thing I could add is that some of the struggles that everybody's highlighting in terms of trying to find good quality people, right? There's definitely a shortage in the market, particularly for a certain skill sets of products that we're using, right, across the stacks and so forth. I think one of the ways we try to mitigate that would be to use a broader perspective of providers, right? Whether they're medium tier or some of the big fours and so forth. But I think, you know, developing talent in our space is I think lacking right now, right? I think, you know, I mean, having been doing this for so long, and it's a good and bad thing in some ways, right? You run across the same people in the space, and so in some ways that's good, right? In some ways that's bad. So I think we could certainly, maybe it's more cybersecurity being educated, you know, through the colleges or becoming more mainstream. But there's a huge shortage out there, right, in our field. So hopefully it does start to turn around at some point, though.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. Before I turn it back over to Julie, I'll just give a bit of a plug relative to IDSA for the folks that are on the phone, and she'll mention what's coming up in San Francisco, but I am almost certain that a number of us that are on the panel are going to be in San Francisco as well. 1 hour is never enough. I highly recommend, if you have questions, if you have concepts or ideas that you'd want to discuss, never hesitate to reach out to anybody that you've seen or heard today, and never hesitate to reach out to us individually. I know that we all maintain public presences that are easy to get a hold of us with, and I know for certain that we're all on the same mission relative to creating a better identity-centric, secured world. And with that, I'll turn it over to Julie.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Thanks, team. That was a great discussion, and I certainly appreciate your time today and contributions in general to the IDSA. Yeah, just to follow on what Richard mentioned, I mean, two sort of relatively easy ways, especially for those of you that are making the trek to RSA, to get engaged with us is our online community. You can see it at the email address, or sorry, the web address on the slide. Would love to have you join the online community. We're working to build that out as taking these kind of conversations online and have that interaction, peer-to-peer interaction. So please look to join the IDSA online community. And then lastly, we will have a meetup event with some drinks and some food and conversation networking at RSA. So look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again for joining us today. You'll receive a link to the webinar recording. I know a few folks have asked that question. Please pass on and share with your colleagues who may have missed the webinar today, as well as post to social media if you think this was a valuable time and conversation for you, which I hope you do. And we hope that you all will join us in our mission of bringing identity and security closer together. So thanks and have a great day.